Hello and welcome everybody to Goldster's Author to Author at a different time. Maybe we're all in a different state of mind, who knows? It's 5 p.m. on a cold winter's day in London and noon across the Atlantic in a much warmer Florida, where our guest is filming on location, I should say, or something that successful creative people do. He was to be in Los Angeles, hence the evening show. Now he's in Florida, and that's why we are at this time. He is a multi-million book bestseller. He has created one of the most intriguing characters of modern fiction, Evan Smoak. In the Orphan X series, hailed as deeply philosophical and powerfully emotional in stories that are riveting and action-packed, say the critics. We're going to be discussing how to build a character that trips such a nerve of popularity with readers and with Hollywood. And that's going to take us into a bigger discussion about all of our hopes, our fears, and our humanity. But my guest is also a breathing, living, creative machine, comic books, screenplays, poetry. He helped write the opening ceremony of the World Cup in Qatar. He researches by going on exercises with elite Navy SEALs and tough guys like that. And outside of his day job, if you can call it that, he works on bridging the divide in our polarized political climate, writing opinion pieces for the mainstream media. And he looks pretty tough, yes, just across there. But he also looks calm and friendly. So welcome, Gregg Hurwitz, the Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you for having me on. I'm delighted to be here.
It's good to see you. And thank you for breaking into your busy day. What exactly are you doing in Florida?
Well, I'm in Miami right now, and I'm shooting an online course, which will be called The Art of Story. It's kind of like a master class about narrative and storytelling. And I'm also participating in a seminar about Exodus, which I'm participating in as a narrative specialist. We have some theologians in from Cambridge and some political commentators and philosophers. It's less political, actually, the emphasis on it. And some, we have a Orthodox icon carver. It's a very eclectic group. And so we've been tackling the story of Exodus and trying to kind of tease it apart in as many ways as we can. So it's eventful days. I'm shooting in mornings and afternoons. And I'm really happy to have a gap in the middle to get to talk to all of you.
Well, that's very good. But Exodus, to create a thriller out of Exodus?
And it's not so much. We're doing a reading of the text and sort of interpreting it in terms of what underlies it. Yeah, so it's going to be I think it's going to wind up being a 16-part discussion. We shot the first part already.
Oh, goodness. It's fantastic what we can do with the media now. You take something like that, and that will go out where, on a mainstream network or on streaming?
It'll go out on Daily Wire Plus, which is a big online studio and network essentially here. And then at some point it's going to be put out, I think, perhaps through other venues as well.
Right. And whilst doing all that, you still have time to create this incredible series. And we've got a lot to get through because we had a pre-show discussion that absolutely fascinated me. And I have to say that if we don't get through it all day, we now have a second chance, because I've just heard that Gregg is coming to London, and at 12 o'clock on February the 9th, we're going to be doing a live event with you at the Riverstone Cinema in Fulham. So if you're in the London area, even if you're not, do come and meet Gregg. Just email concierge@goldster.co.uk, concierge@goldster.co.uk. Many of you will know that email, and you will be sent all the details. I want to talk about the creation of character in books, because it's what draws us into the novel. So without me saying anything, tell us exactly how you thought of and who Orphan X is.
So Orphan X is the start of my series. It was my 16th novel, and I have to tell you, I was scared to embark upon it. I'd grown up reading James Bond and Jason Bourne, and I love Jack Reacher, right? There's all these wonderful characters in the pantheon, and I really wanted to write a series character, but I kept kind of putting it off. I kept backburnering it, so the character kept developing in my mind and developing in my mind. Until I really felt like I was ready to engage and had made him sufficiently distinctive that this was somebody who I could spend time with. I spend more waking hours in my books and with my characters than I do with my family. And so I had to make sure that I really had a deep connection to this character and I thought it through. And Evan is a foster kid. He was in a foster home in East Baltimore. And at the age of 12, he's pulled out of the foster home and he's trained to be an off-the-books assassin by a program that's buried very deep in the Department of Defense in America. And he's essentially trained to be an expendable weapon, taking a kid who nobody wants, training him in all the arts of assassination. And that's also, it includes hacking, it includes hand-to-hand, it includes sniping, it includes psychological operations, psyops, endurance and discipline, and they basically build him into a disposable weapon. But one of the key differences is that his father figure and his handler, whose name is Jack Johns, actually loves him. It's a very close relationship. And so it's confusing in some ways as he's being trained to kill people. He also has in Jack a father figure and not just a former CIA handler. And Jack tells him very early on, the hard part is not turning you into a killer. The hard part will be keeping you human. And that for me is the key line around which the whole series coalesces, because when we first meet Evan, this is all backstory. He's already gone through the program. Those two conflicting instincts to be human and to stay human and to be an assassin, they're like trains on a collision course. And so at some point he's fled the program because his own moral compass no longer aligns with it. And he's essentially become a pro bono assassin. He has an encrypted number that people can call, 1-855 to nowhere, office code name the Nowhere Man. And people call him when they're in desperate straits, when they're being terrorized by a person or an organization and they have nowhere else to turn and no one else who will help them. He's like the last refuge. And so as much as he's on the run from this program that trained him, he then will go and do anything to help a client and complete a mission and restore to them the kind of normal life that he himself can never have by dint of his extreme upbringing.
So there's a lot of, as you said, sort of moral confluences going in there. And there was one of them, is it Dark Horses or the Prodigal Son? But one of them, there is a drug baron who's a pretty bad guy who asks for his help. Tell us about that.
So that's a Dark Horse. And you're correct. When he answers that phone, it's usually somebody who's in desperate need and they need help. And this time at the beginning of Dark Horse, which is the last book that came out, it's somebody who's actually a very bad man. He's a cartel figure. He sort of exists at the edge of laws and regulations. He's kind of cartel 2.0. He moves money around. He deals fentanyl. He is Mexican, but lives in Texas now. And he has this sort of secret empire. But his daughter, who is lovely and innocent and 17 years old, is kidnapped by a rival full-blown psychopathic cartel leader. And so he calls Evan for help. And it's this very unusual thing because when Evan answers the phone every time, he says, "Do you need my help?" And there's somebody who needs his help. And this time, the character, whose name is Aragon Urea, needs his help, but he's more like the kind of person who Evan would kill, right, than that he would help. And so there's a lot of ambiguity in this because Aragon Urea holds up a very dark mirror to Evan. He too exists on the outside of the law. He too has vigilante aspects. And as much as he is dealing with drugs, with meds that are illegal, he also is sort of the center of a moral universe in his community. He funds the schools, he helps people, he pays for their medications. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is he really more corrupt than big biopharmaceutical companies in America, right? He's just doing the street version of that. But Evan has to do a dance with him to figure out, is this someone I can trust? And his daughter is somebody who certainly needs his help. And so can Evan help a very bad man? And that's a question he's been asking himself in the mirror for a lot of years since he fled the program. And so there's a real reflection in this mission of him coming to understand and determine whether or not he can forgive or help or heal Aragon Urea and his family is the same question that he's asking about himself. It's a very deadly mission this time out.
I love this sort of complex moral compass that you're giving us. And I want to go into it more, but before I want to get back to those characters that you said you grew up with and do a little bit of comparison, because the New York Times described the Orphan X series as big Bourne and Reacher energy. So that's the Jason Bourne, and that's Jack Reacher. Tell us who those characters are in your mind and how they compare or are to the Orphan X character.
Well, they are, as we know, recurrent series characters. And what's different about Evan is I have a description I use in every book. I say he's average size, average build, just an ordinary guy, not too handsome. He's not the best looking guy like James Bond. He's not the biggest guy like Jack Reacher. He's not the best sniper like Swagger. So he has to bring the totality of himself to the mission. He's really good at a lot of things, but he's much more like Ulysses. He's the man of many wiles, right? He's not the best archer. He's not, right? And so he has all these subject matter experts who've taught him who are exceptional. And his job is to sort of navigate that, and he can blend in anywhere. That's the job of an orphan, is to be so ordinary that someone's eyes will pass right over him. But he's incredibly lethal and he's incredibly disciplined. And he conducts his life according to the 10 Assassins' Commandments, which is a very rigid set of boundaries and rules that govern his engagement with the world. But as he finds, that tension is that one comment that I make about Evan is that because of his upbringing, he never learned to speak the strange language of intimacy. And now where he hides is cover identity is he lives in a penthouse on the Wilshire corridor in LA among all these other people. He's got a big penthouse suite. It's quite modern. It's 7,000 square feet. And he's constantly engaging with the real world. And it's one of the things that makes the series quite different is that he'll go from a knife fight and then he'll walk in and he'll get dragged into some terrible meeting at the homeowners association where they're debating like what new carpet to put in the lobby as he's bleeding through his sleeve. And so these archetypal characters like James Bond and Bourne that we know and love, Evan goes from those things to living in the real world where you and I live. And he's completely ill-suited to do this. He would way rather garrote a child molester in a Turkish bathhouse than make small talk by the mail slots, but he's forced to do so when his elderly neighbor comes along and is kind of pestering him, and all he wants to do is go upstairs and get back to his discipline routine. So he's sort of thawing into an understanding of what it means to be human.
And I want to get to the human business in a moment, but the Bourne didn't he come from a secret covert American operations? There are parallels there, are there?
That's right. And he, the biggest thing with Bourne is he forgot who he was. It's very much a question of identity, right? And for me, what's interesting is I started writing Orphan X. I wasn't thinking about this because the stories don't come from philosophy down. They just occur to me in stories, and then they sort of connect with psychology. But I realized that I started writing this when I was right on the cusp of 40, about 10 years ago. I started the series. And a lot of it is about his shedding the rules and the armor of a previous way of living to try and move into a different understanding of the world. And I think it mirrors a lot of ways, what I was dealing with around that pivot point of going, well, what do I want to keep and what do I want to get rid of, and what served me my whole life and what no longer serves me. And as he's trying to figure out what it means to be a person, really, I feel like Evan is like Pinocchio, but he wants to be a real boy. And so he's
what were you doing, Greg, between 20 and 40 that you then wanted to shed your skins and be somebody else?
I don't know if it's that extreme, but I certainly got to 40. I was very fortunate in my career. I mean, I sold my first book right out of university. And so I've been a writer. I was writing all the way through and writing movies and books and other things. But I think it's more about aspects of being. Right. So I had a question when I was around 40. I thought, well, is that it? Am I going to write another 20 novels and another, 10 screenplays? Or what's a different way that I'm going to have? What's a different relationship I can have with meaning in my life? What are different ways? What are some skills that carried me forward? There's certain disciplines and that have hardened into maybe rigidities around schedule, around writing, around other things that I no longer need to carry with me, right? What are the things that I can shed? And so some of that, I think it's a process that we're always engaged in, right? We're always trying to figure out how to accommodate and assimilate new information, how to make relationships better, how to find different kinds of meaning in the world. And so for Evan, this is all just writ large, right? Because he was a trained assassin. Everything was black and white thinking. If he was a true believer, his life would be so much easier, but he's not, because Jack gave him that Achilles heel to say, I want you to remain human, because he cares about him. And so Evan's process of trying to square being a deadly assassin who can never really be with anybody, right? But who wants to engage, who wants to understand this sort of human engagement and wants to protect and know people, is really the template for it. And he has a relationship.
The parallel there that you're drawing, and I'm going to keep these parallels in mind as we talk. So let's go back to Evan as an orphan. And we were discussing this earlier, when you have people that have had, not the family life, the sort of life where you do get stuff knocked out of you, that does drain the humanity and empathy and all of those natural feelings out of you, which was necessary, was it, in order for him to be a good assassin?
That's right. That's right. And so, that requires black and white thinking. And basically, the people are messy. His life's incredibly clean. He has OCD. He lives, it's like stainless steel fixtures. He trains, he meditates. His bed is a floating mattress that's propelled by mattresses. It's a slab of floating metal with a mattress on top of it. Everything is around discipline and order. He drinks the world's greatest vodkas, because it's almost like it's something that's purifying. He'll have like 1.5 drinks only. Everything is about that. But humans are messy. Humans will mess up your schedule. When you engage with them, you have feelings, you have emotion. It starts to pollute this black and white frame on the world. And in fact, early in the series, he begins a relationship with there's a single mother downstairs from him called Mia Hall. And Mia, represents the other side of that. She's a district attorney. She can never know who he is, or she'd have to imprison him. And he begins this sort of relationship with him. And she's got an 8-year-old boy named Peter, who I think is a reflection for Evan of his own being orphaned, because he's lost a father. And Peter's being raised in the world kind of more properly. And so it's a bittersweet contrast for Evan in some ways. But when he's down at Mia's house, as opposed to his impeccable OCD penthouse, there's laundry on the couch, and there's crayons matched in the carpet, and there's dishes on the counter, and there's candles and throw pillows, and there's warmth and life and sense and smell. And so part of that aliveness for him, part of that distancing from his OCD, and engaging in life, there's parts that are good and there's parts that are bad that he doesn't know how to contend with, as he sort of has this dalliance with her.
And we've had a few authors on that were in the intelligence services before, writing nonfiction, and I always ask them this about, how much can you not tell the truth to your partner or to your friends if you want to retain an intimate and trusting relationship? This is something that you're feeding in all the time, isn't it? Of how much do you give of yourself?
That's right. And he's in a world where no one can ever know where he is. He's the nowhere man, right? He's Orphan X. He's always receding. And I think of it like all these people have these lives. Like from his penthouse apartment, he can see in the apartment across from him. It's like a dollhouse. And he can see families. He can see a young father and his toddlers just learning to walk. He can see couples having meals, and he's alone. And I think of him very much like he's got his face up to the aquarium glass, and he's looking through at all these people leading these ordinary lives that he himself never can. But as a wolf who can hunt other wolves, he can protect those people who call him and need him, and preserve for them the kind of life that he himself can never have.
Yeah. And how do you get his number? You can't Google it, presumably, and sort of mystery man, and it comes up on LinkedIn.
His number is 1-855 to nowhere, and in the United States, you can call that number, and in fact, you can see if he's going to answer.
Oh, really?
But it's passed on. Every time when he completes a mission, he asks the person he just helped to find somebody else in need, and they give them that phone number, so that the it kind of moves them from being a victim, right, to being a savior, or it's an act of empowerment in some ways, because after he restores for them their life, he tasks them with doing the same for somebody else. And so he never knows when that phone's going to ring.
And that's it. So for our audience, we've heard about Orphan X now. If you've got any questions to ask for Gregg, comments to say, anything like that, put it in the chat and we will feed it into the conversation. But there was one phrase that he has there that I noted down is, how you do anything is how you do everything. Explain that to us.
That's Evan's second commandment of the 10 Assassins' Commandments. And it means that it's the second. Yeah. And so, you know, what you bring, the focus that you bring around perfectionism to anything in his training has to be impeccable, right? He has to have all of his gear is in order, right? All of his reconnaissance has to be precise. And so there's nothing that he can leave to chance. There's nothing that he can engage with lazily or imperfectly. But you can see also that commandment, if it rears out of control, can turn into OCD. It can turn into looping thoughts. It can turn into him being frozen, for instance, over his bed. There's one time where he's trying to get the wrinkles out of the sheets in his bed. And every time he pulls one side of the bed, the other side wrinkles, and he's stuck in a loop. And so when he's stressed, sometimes the OCD will coil a bit tightly around the base of his, you know, his lizard brain, and it can get the better of him until he can talk his way through and out of it again.
Okay. And these commandments, how do they compare, say, to our 10 commandments?
Well, one of them is never kill an innocent.
Right.
You know, the first commandment is assume nothing. They're about a very Zen-like engagement with the world, but they set these parameters for him too. The fourth commandment, never make it personal. They're just as firm. They're just as muscular in some sense. But they're different.
And never kill an innocent. There's a sort of there's a bit of a common ground between them.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point of overlap.
You know, I know that, you know, ours of thou shalt not kill, but I mean, there's a sort of moral compass on both that run in parallel there.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah,
it's a set of ethics. It's a code. He has a hero's code, right? The commandments are code. They're the law wrapped in the sacred. That's what the 10 commandments are. And so for him, his code, you have to have a character who has a code, right? Especially if he's a vigilante, or else you just have somebody out there indiscriminately killing people. Yeah. And so part of that code for him is also minimal possible force. Yeah. Right.
So did you make those up? Were they your commandments that you put in there, or did you get them from some secret file somewhere?
The secret commandments file. Let me just rifle through this old trunk in the corner and see what's happening with other commandments. Yeah, I made them up. And what's funny is, and this happens a lot with writing, you know, I put them in order. I kind of made them up piecemeal. I mean, in Orphan X, I think I wrote the second and the third and the seventh. Like, I didn't even have them all written. And what's amazing is the order that they've come together over the course of the books. They make sense. There's a reason why they're in the order that they are, that I wasn't thinking of consciously, just sort of subconsciously happens a lot in writing, where I'll write something and then I'll look back on it and go, oh, it's organized, it's ordered in a way that makes sense, that my subconscious was knitting that tapestry together while my prefrontal cortex was off doing other stuff.
So since we're talking about commandments, tell us what one of the projects you're actually filming in Florida about Exodus, and then we can talk a little bit about, you know, how that works together. Do you, for example, when you come up across a situation, use Evan's commandments there yourself? Are they an instinctive part of your thinking now?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of them are. I mean, how you do anything is how you do everything was a governing ethic of mine. And it served me really well, you know, but also that can also get out of control, as it does for Evan. There's challenges to it. But I have been in a situation, it's really interesting, when I've been faced with really hard circumstances, if something comes up personally, there are times I have asked myself, what would I do if I was writing a story about myself right now and I wanted a character to act heroically? How would I write that character? And then I've tried to do that thing. I've tried to embody that state of mind, because I'm not good enough to do that on my own. It's hard, when you're under pressure, when you're suffering, when there's some hard condition, right? That's where all the cracks come out. And so it is interesting that I've used the writing process as a kind of tool to try and, access a higher and better version of myself than in fact I am.
And is that what happened when you were turning 40, 10 years ago? And you thought, I need to create a new character. I need new commandments to live by.
I mean, honestly, that is what happened. I wasn't thinking that consciously at all. I mean, I don't write deductively. I don't write from the philosophical down. I thought of a story that would interest me. I thought of a character that would engage me. I thought of upbringing and stories. He was the smallest kid in the foster home. That's another mirror of me. I was tiny when I started high school. I got sent off to an all boys Jesuit high school. It was 1,200 boys. And I was from an atheist Jewish background. Then that's my familial background. And I was the smallest kid in the entire school. I was 5'2", 90 pounds. And so a lot of it was, I think I felt like I had to have some process of self-creation there, not to just be, undone by this dominance hierarchy that was very hard for me to find a place to at first blush. And it's another thing I didn't think about that clearly, but Evan was the smallest kid in the whole foster home.
I was going to say,
he's recruited out of there when Jack Johns recruits him out. Part of it is he gets knocked down the most, but as Jack observes, he also gets up the most. And so he chose him on the basis of that grit. Yeah. And then Evan kind of grew up into this lethal character, this lethal figure. But he always carries with him. Jack tells him, you remember that vulnerability that you felt. You never forget that. You carry that in your bones so that when you engage with other people.
That first day as a little boy that you walked into this school of a strange culture, strange religion, strange everything, I guess, and I mean, it happened to me as well, happens to a lot of us. That's when you suddenly think, holy Moses, what's going on? And then the next day you think, well, I got to sort this out to survive it. And this is what you're writing about, really, isn't it?
It is. It's so blindingly obvious in hindsight, but I just thought, I'm just writing a book. I'm just writing a story. That's what I do when I'm writing. I'm writing about Evan, and I'm sending him into the world in conflicts that are thrilling and with engagements that are suspenseful, where he's on a mission where he's engaging with something that is menacing and deadly, but it also holds a key to unlocking a part of him, right? So that the external challenge always has to be mirrored in compelling fashion with something that he's up against within himself. And so the two of those things kind of work in concert with him. They're at a tension with each other.
Yeah.
And often it involves having a...
I mean, we were talking to Lisa Unger, who's your colleague, yesterday. We seem to have because you're both co-chairs of International Thriller Writers, which is a great organization. But you write very different books, but you're both writing suspense thrillers. And we were talking about the sort of muddled, inconclusive nature of characters. And I was asking whether the reader wants to have a definite ending, like Clint Eastwood riding off into the sunset, having won the victory in the town or something like that, or whether they prefer the sort of muddled inconclusivity, rather like your drug baron in Dark Horses, who's got good sides and a lot of bad sides.
I move increasingly to the latter. I mean, when I think before I started my career, I was thinking really in terms of heroes and villains. And as my career's progressed, I'm not interested in writing them anymore. I'm interested in writing antagonists and protagonists. Yeah. And I used to think that making the bad guy immensely evil would somehow kind of accrue positively to my character. But more and more I think about that I want to write an antagonist who's so compelling in their worldview that we feel that we can relate to it. It's sort of whispering darkly in our ear. And if I can bring Evan Smoak into that encounter that's way more complicated and way more deeply moral, or morally confounding, and still he can figure out how to navigate some partial reestablishment of order, let's say, from the chaotic without compromising himself and his code, and manage to do some good, that actually it's a more engaging experience
Yeah.
for me to write and for readers to read in a lot of ways, rather
And
than
do the readers prefer that, or do they prefer the straight good guy, bad guy thing?
there's different preferences. I mean, I come down with this on Lisa, where Lisa is. I'm writing into and towards greater ambiguity as I go.
Yeah, that's Pauline is.
Look,
Pauline
we also
Blasey
want to have clear thrillers
Sorry, go on.
that are. Yeah, we're doing a bit of a Zoom wrap between us, I think, right now. But yeah, I want to have they are clearly structured, right? They have to be swiftly plotted. They're big, classic, old-fashioned thrillers in one regard, right? So within the constraints of that structure, within the constraints of a clear mission and outcome and action and intrigue and suspense, then for me, those sort of set the parameters into which I can infuse a great deal of ambiguity, or as much ambiguity as I can. And that to me is the balance that is compelling.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I was going to say, Pauline Blasey is saying, makes sense you've been able to create this alternative commandment list, Jesuits, atheists, Jewish background, very interesting. And then she's coming in, backing you and Lisa, more complex, although the rider off into the sunset is only a pause. They go in our imagination if well crafted. So that's not, there's never that sort of happy ending, because we know life's not that simple. But I have a note here next to my thing with Lisa, is that Evan has got these sort of personal confluences and conflicts, as you mentioned. But when he's out there meeting people that you know are bad, and he sort of floors them very skillfully by seeing how their weapons work or how their muscles are twitching and that sort of thing, he doesn't have any conflict. He just does it.
Yeah, I mean, or if conflict arises, he goes down a particular checklist that he has in his head. I mean, he's got an operational process set of ROIs that he engages in, almost like an automatum. But more and more, as he gets more human, as he starts to understand more, it's changing that, and it's threatening that. It's threatening the way that he operates. It's confusing him. He's having to make different choices. So wading into the gray is a complication for him that requires more of him. He can't merely go back and rely, here's the rules that engage the world that is shaped into black and white, that he no longer has that luxury. So his evolution carries with it equal part blessing or equal part curse to blessing.
Okay. Now we've talked about Bourne and Orphan X, James Bond, and that. Does a character like Orphan X actually exist? Do you ring up a secret number at the Department of Defense and they give you his profile?
I'll say yes.
Did you say yes?
I'll say yes to that, because why not? It's more, isn't it funny to think so?
Yeah, which brings me to a wider question. When you're doing your sort of thriller writing and the research that you do, that I want you to tell us about in a second, but when you do that, how accurate do you have to be? We were talking at a couple of shows a couple of weeks about Frederick Forsyth and how he broke through with the Day of the Jackal in all the research and everything. Do you think doesn't matter, I can make that up, I don't know what this is going to look like, or do you feel you have to get it all right? Or is there a right when you're dealing with someone like Evan?
I like to get things right. I do a lot of research. As you mentioned, I've gone undercover into mind control cults. I've snuck onto demolition ranges with SEALs to blow up cars. I've been up in stunt airplanes. I like to go and get a front row seat to the action so that I can describe differently the scene for readers. So for instance, before I wrote Orphan X, I went and shot all the guns that he shoots. I trained in mixed martial arts fighting. I'm not implying I'm particularly good. It was a process of having my face repeatedly smashed into the training mat. But if I'm experiencing a chokehold that's an effective chokehold, there's a feeling of claustrophobia that I encountered that I can write about and make it very different from the usual, what would be perhaps a more cliched description had I not done it and had I relied on books that I've read and movies that I've seen, right? Because readers have seen all those books and read all those movies too. And then they're reading something that's an imitation of an imitation. And so I prefer to go and really engage in it firsthand, to be able to write and pick things that give it, this ring of verisimilitude that can carry the reader across the suspension of disbelief.
And how do you, I mean, let's say you take a 12-month thing from book to book, in the actual writing element, the working out what the story is going to be, and you're going out and getting beaten up by the Navy SEALs or whatever, how would that time be divided?
Oh, I try to stack research at the in-field research towards the beginning. And part of that is that the research process, it's a process of discovery, right? I want to be open to opportunity. I don't just research to fill in the blanks of the story that I'm writing, right? What I want to, when I'm talking to subject matter experts, I want to know how they see the world. I want to pull on their face and see the world through their eye holes, right? That's what we're doing when we're writing a character. And so I'll give you a story. I wrote a book that's a medical thriller, and I was interviewing a guy whose job, he was a hospital technician, was to carve the cadavers up with a Sawzall blade and send the different parts to different departments, right? So the elbows go to the orthopods and the heads were going to neurology. And so I'm sitting there conducting this interview, wishing that I'd worn, galoshes. And he finished and he walked across the room, and there was these two enormous stainless steel doors. And he opens the doors, and inside are 24 corpses suspended from their heads by figure-8 scissor clamps that clamp and pinch the ear so that the feet are floating several inches above the floor. And the reason the corpses are stored that way is that if you store them flat on their backs, they distort, and that makes them less helpful for students, for medical students in anatomy. And he grabbed one of these and dragged it across. They're like on a meat hook chain, lowered it to the table and began carving it up again. And for me, it was this wonderful moment, because I thought, I have this character, and I had a scene that I knew I was going to write in the book where he's running through the hospital at night being pursued when it's empty on a floor, and he needs somewhere to hide. And what better place to do it than a place that's like that, but it's not a magical, spooky, mystical thing that readers can't connect to. There's a reason for it. It exists. I can set it up in the hospital, right? Yeah. But when I do that, had I not been willing to go on site, had I been unwilling to have that conversation with that expert, I wouldn't have discovered the room. And so the research is a process of discovery.
Yeah, I've never heard about the, hanging vertically like that. That is an incredible, and then a myriad of ideas would come from that. Jennifer actually says, fascinating. She likes this setting when you ask the questions. It's interactive. It's more engaging than just listening to a talk. What do you reckon, Greg? Do you prefer this sort of thing, or do you prefer, giving a straight talk to people and then signing?
I much prefer Q&A or a conversation more than Q&A, really, because Q&A is also a little reductive. Because part of what happens is, we can tailor towards people's interests, but also it keeps me from having answers that are more rote. If I'm giving a talk, I think I'm much more of a conversationalist. And when I'm writing the books, I get to talk for 400 pages uninterrupted. So who wants me to do that here, right? It's much more engaging to hear how you are, right, and the things that interest you. And a lot of times, if you ask different questions, like I had to thought through some of those perspectives on the 10 commandments, right? It'll bring new things to light for me as well. Yeah. So it's more fun. It feels more.
And since you're coming over here to London, I have to tell you this. You've probably heard it before, that if you read in a book or see on a movie a man in the States in a suit running down the street, he's running to save the world in a thriller. If you see the same man running down a street in London in a suit, he's running to catch a bus. And that is the difference between the way that the US, your types of sort of hard-edged, high-stakes thriller goes, and our types, which are more sort of muddled, like the George Smiley character from John le Carré, and we have Slow Horses now, which is a new one of a bunch of failed spies that don't get up to much.
Le Carré is so wonderful, though. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I did use The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. was a book I went back and reread before writing Orphan X.
Yeah.
He's so wonderful. He's such a was such a skilled observer of the human condition. So he's someone that I always strive to have that level of cool. He's always so cool, psychological.
It is cool,
insight.
isn't it? Yeah, and spare.
Yeah, and he's not overly. He's so brilliant without ever sounding cerebral or overly erudite. He always maintains that sort of gut impulse. So I think he's wonderful, and I also am quite a fan of Lee Child is another one of your countrymen, though I guess we get to claim him because the Reacher series are set in America. And
nobody knows.
Go ahead.
I mean, few people know that he's called Jim Grant, and few people know that he's British. But he had a similar, I don't know what you call it, because I don't think the same thing happened to you. But around 40, he was fired from Granada Television, and he went away and wrote Jack Reacher. Otherwise, he would have been broke. So maybe 40 is this turning point. And Emma says, as a reader, I prefer characters who represent real human beings. Humans have these polarities. That's a good word, of good and evil coexisting. It's just that most people have more good will than evil, and that to me is human. I really like your viewpoints. I will read your book, and Pauline says definitely going to read your books now. So you have two extra readers at least here. I wanted to move. We are running through. I just wanted to tell people what a boring life you say you lead, that you describe your day-to-day life as humdrum. I wake up, have a coffee, go to my office and write all day. Is that the boring life that you lead?
Well, it is. I mean, it gets interrupted with adventures, but if I'm home and writing, that's my work day. That's my ideal work day. But, then if I do research, I travel, I do book tours. I mean, there's a lot more that can intervene, and I like having lots of adventures. But there's a sort of focus that needs attention. The discipline needs a kind of the focus requires a kind of discipline.
Yes, and that. So would you do that in a state like a 3-month or a 6-month spell, and then you see the outside world after that?
It's all interrupted now, to be honest with you. It's a lot harder to have the boundaries. So I'm fighting to kind of maintain a bit more order at the edges of things. But right now I'm pretty shuffled because I'm heading into a book tour. I'm shooting here. I have a trip in between. I just got back from the Middle East. So I'm trying to find it. It'd be wonderful to have a 3-month span that I don't do anything, but I got to see. You said you got back from the Middle East. Let me ask you about your writing for the World Cup entries. This was a sort of a tangent to your career, was it? Yeah, well, they wanted to work. They wanted the theme to be unity, the Qatari government. And I went with 2 compatriots. One is a wonderful screenwriter named Lita Kalogridis. She wrote the Avatar movie with James Cameron. She wrote Shutter Island. And another is a friend of mine called Samar Ali, who's an international rights lawyer. She was a protege of Desmond Tutu, human rights lawyer. She's teaches a course on unity at Vanderbilt with John Meacham, the presidential historian, and was a mediator in the Syrian civil war. So we went in a little team of 3 of us, and we engaged with them, and then we wrote. We helped sort of interface about the whole ceremony, which was quite wonderful. And we talked to the Qatari government a lot about what they were trying to accomplish and what their worldview was, and it was a very engaging discussion. Kind of conversation strained through this creative process we were doing. And then we wrote the opening dialogue. It was between Morgan Freeman and a young Qatari influencer. His name is Ghanem, who was born without any legs and is this amazing kind of upbeat spirit who embodies the underdog spirit of Qatar. And so we wrote this piece, and it was amazing to go back there, some months later, and to sit in the stadium and to see this thing unfold before, I think it's 3.5 billion people. It was just majestic.
That's an incredible thing to have on your CV. I see Emma's got a hand up, and I'm going to break all the rules after this next question. Let Emma talk to you directly. We don't usually do this, but this is such an engaging conversation. But before we do that, the Qatar World Cup, there was a lot of polarization there, wasn't there, about whether people should go, not go, LGBT rights, human rights, and all that sort of stuff. This is one of your, I don't know what you call it, non-day job things that you do. Tell us about it.
I engage a lot working against extremism and polarization. And a lot of times that comes from trying to step back from dehumanization of the other side. And so one of the things that I learned in Qatar isn't that, the issue came up, for instance, that 6,500 workers died in the decade leading up to building these stadiums.
Yeah.
Well, that's horrific, right? And they have a worker program that's in place. Well, okay, so that's one way to look at it. But the other piece of it, well, no, that's a valid way that's a horrible number of people and families that happened to. But from another lens, I live in Los Angeles, right? We're a fairly affluent city. We had 2,000 homeless people die in the streets last year alone. And so the question becomes one that is sort of like, well, we all have work to do, don't we? We have a lot of construction deaths. You have a lot of construction deaths in the UK. We have a lot in the US. A lot of them are immigrants who are Mexican. And so part of the process becomes, are we not, it's not about hypocrisy necessarily, but like, why are we judging Qatar by this really intense standard in a different way, let's say, than maybe we did Brazil when they were bulldozing through favelas, right? Or Argentina, which had just come out of a fairly violent, transition of power. Yeah. And so part of that has to do, to some extent, I think, because it was the Middle East, right? The Middle East feels more exotic to the West, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, with gay and lesbian rights, my co-writer, Lita Kalogridis, is openly bisexual, went there and was welcomed. I was welcomed there as a Jew. And we asked that. We said, look, you still have the death penalty for this. That sounds horrific. But how many people has Qatar put to death in the last 20 years? One, and it was for rape last year. Well, that pales in comparison to what happened in the US. And in fact, in the opening weekend, the only shooting massacre that occurred in an LGBTQ club was in Colorado, right? And so there's the strictness of the laws that are stated. Certainly, I'm not implying it would be easy to be gay in Qatar, or yeah. I would rather be gay there than in the United States. But what I mean is that it's important to try to kind of contextualize things so that we're not flattening the entirety of the Middle East into Iran or into, right? It's trying to get to view things in both contextually and to look at where people have come from and what are the ways that they're working and striving to recognize different rights. What are the ways that they've made amendments in the worker system as opposed to where it was. So
and you get people sitting across a table so they're not yelling at each other and canceling each other and insulting people on Twitter. That's your aim, is it?
Well, it's a lot of what I do. I mean, I'm here in Miami, the Exodus seminars with quite a few very prominent conservatives and conservative thinkers. My own politics tend sort of center left, slightly left. I'm more of a classic liberal. But yes, I mean, I've gone and done events in the US where we take 10 Congress people from the Republican Party and 10 Congress people from the Democrat Party and have a dinner that's kind of mediated to see about trying to rebuild understanding across the aisle. Because if we don't have that, all we have is out of control polarization, which then leads to dehumanization, which then creates an authorizing environment for violence.
Yeah.
And
well, we might get you to do a bit of that over here because we've got people shouting at each other, and our House of Commons is designed for people to yell at each other as if there's no credibility on either side. Stay with us for a moment. I've just got to tell our wonderful people what is coming up. If anybody wants any more questions for Gregg, and we're going to see him again on February the 9th live, but also stream. So if you want us to pick up on any topics, just put it in the chat and we will do that on February the 9th. And January 26th, that's next Thursday, Lucinda is with a fantastic travel writer, Tobias Jones, with his latest book, A Gorgeous Journey Along the River Po, which is Italy's equivalent to the River Thames or America's Mississippi. That'll be a journey not to be missed. And then on the 27th, Lucinda hosts Book of the Month. This reminds me of you going to that Jesuit place with the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, the icon of 20th century literature, an awe-inspiring teacher, Jean Brodie, telling her class how to act and think. This is going to be a Goldster non-recorded free-range chat, so you can kick back and say whatever you want. February the 2nd, Lucinda is with Laura Payne, once a high-flying journalist, then a media and marketing advisor to some of the world's leading business organizations, and then, oh my goodness, this sounds a little bit like what people do. Then in her 50s, she decided to change her life and career and become a psychotherapist. Her book is 9 Steps to a Mindful Life Without Meditating. And then Lucinda, February 3rd, is with the fabulous Julie Summers and her highly acclaimed book, Jam Busters, the story of the Women's Institute during the Second World War that inspired the television series Home Fires, as in Keep the Home Fires Burning. And you may have heard me talk about welcoming back the wonderful Lena Sisko with her new book, Honest Answers. That was to be on February the 9th, but because of Gregg, Lena is agreeing to move. She's a former military interrogator who now teaches how to read people, particularly whether they're telling the truth and whether you can trust them. And she's been a great sport, and we're hoping to see her in early March. And February the 9th, I am with, I don't know who this person is, Gregg Hurwitz again, this time live at the Riverstone Cinema on the banks of the River Thames. Come and meet Gregg live. Just email concierge@goldster.co.uk. I think that's right, and reserve your slot. Gregg will be signing books, mingling, listening, plotting, being a genuinely nice guy that he is. And you can get your early copy of the new Orphan X thriller, The Last Orphan. That's right, isn't it, Gregg?
That's right. I didn't realize that I'd inconvenienced an intelligence expert in my trip here. I might be in trouble. I'm going to need to come with
I offered her all the Riverstone pluses when she comes over here, so I think it's a win-win all round.
Please thank her for me.
That's the thing. Sue says, looking forward to reading the Orphan X books. There is a waiting list for every one of them at our library. That's a good to know. Never known that to happen before. You've really, so just on that point, 10 years you've been doing Orphan X. When did you feel that it had the traction that it was going to break through and become this compelling character?
Boy, we had a really good kind of upgrade in sales at the last moment before Orphan X went on sale. There was a spot kind of opened up at some of the bigger stores in LA or in America, I mean. And so the order was like upsized, but I've had, I've written a lot of books. So I've had a career that sort of steadily, slowly and mostly steadily has built, right? But there's been some drawbacks and other movement, but I had a pretty big couple of breakout books that were preceding this. But I'd say by the third book, so the first book, Orphan X, was a big success. It was my biggest success in my career by far. And by about the fourth book, we'd really started to get traction. But the second book already was a #1 bestseller for the Times in England. So it went pretty quickly. But there's always more books to be sold, right? And more things to do. But I've certainly been happy and I feel like I have the luckiest job in the world. I get to wake up and sit down and just write whatever I'm thinking about. And so I kind of get up and write a wave of gratitude to my desk every morning.
Yeah, and that is great. Now, this is your final question, unless audiences have got more questions for us, because we talked about your watershed at 40. According to your website, you are now 50, Gregg, which edges you towards
my friend.
Not yet?
I still got some time. I'm still holding on by my fingernails to those 40s. You don't have to upgrade me that swiftly.
Are you really? Well, I'll have to talk to Wikipedia about that then, but you're about to become 50. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. So, but that edges you into the Goldster theatre of living. I mean, not immediately, but just give us an idea. We've talked about a lot of things here about working things out in the mind, about getting out, meeting people, researching, and that Goldster's mission is for people to stay as healthy as can be as the years go by, with as little medication as possible, staying involved in the community and everything like that. Fiction, imagination, conversations, what we've been having today, how does that feed into the mission?
Oh, I think it's everything. I mean, we thrive on contact. we thrive on conversation, right? Stimulation, engaging around something that we love. I love having conversations with readers, right? Because it's such a shared thing. And there's such an intimate relationship between novelist and reader that's very different than in other art forms, right? If I write a movie, everybody sees the same movie. If I write a Batman comic, everybody reads the same comic. But if I sell 1 million copies of The Last Orphan, every single movie that plays in every reader's head is distinct. They bring to it their own experience. They bring to it their hopes and dreams and fears and anxieties and all sorts of things. And so it's a very personal relationship between novelists and readers, because the reader has to resurrect the story and is like a co-creator, almost like a collaborator in the act of the story. So I think it's enormously good for imagination, and we all need a lot of, especially in a world that's increasingly fragmenting in certain ways. We see a fragmenting of a lot of communities. It's important to be joined together and discussing things that are passions.
Yeah, that's it. And do you think you'll have a change of thinking at all when you reach that 50 watershed, or you'll just keep going now?
I have a change of thinking all the time, it seems like now. That was the big change of thinking, is to just realize that I have to be in a place of lots of changes of thinking.
Okay. One very quick one-word answer. Suri, what nonfiction have you written?
Oh, I've written a good number of op-eds and essays. You can find some of that on my website, which is gregghurwitz.net. But yeah, I've written more of my nonfiction is focused on that. I published some of my academic work from undergrad and graduate, but it's sort of Jungian and Freudian analysis of Shakespearean tragedy. I'm not sure that's what you're looking for, but should that be of interest, well, that's findable.
Suri, let us know, and come to Riverstone in Fulham on February the 9th, and we can discuss those sort of nonfiction things. Pauline, finally, love the way of looking at it. A collaboration between reader and writer. Was having a similar conversation with my sister just last night. That is, Time's Winged Chariot is now upon us. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for our podcast audience that's tuning in now. Thank you, Gregg, for being such a, I mean, you know, we could keep going on and I would be on the edge of my seat, which is what a thriller writer has to do. If you have any comments, questions, send them through to concierge@goldster.co.uk and use that same address to book in to see Gregg in person on February the 9th at midday at Riverstone in Fulham. You Google that, it'll come up. And we're going to delve further into thriller writing, the complexities of the human condition, suspense fiction, and all things creative. Until then, stay active, stay involved, stay curious, stay safe, and of course, stay Goldster. Gregg Hurwitz, thank you for being such a fabulous guest, and see you in February. Bye.
I'm looking forward to it. Bye.
Bye.